Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Lisa Christensen, President and CEO of the Alaska World Affairs Council. I'm really giddy about today's program. We are featuring Dr. Frank von Hippel, who will be speaking about chemical consequences in a program moderated by Dr. Jim Muller. Both speaker and the moderator are amazing professors, authors. One of them is an amazing skier. Both have books that were recently published. You may have seen them in our pre-program slide deck. We will also have links on our website. They actually are there right now if you want to go in and see those. And I'll give you information about where you can buy these books. We'll show them again in our post-program slide deck. Do check out these books when you can: The Chemical Age by Dr. von Hippel and The River War by Dr. Muller. All of you who are joining us, please say hello to us in the chat session here of the Zoom. Siobhan Choi is our technical guru. She'll help you if you're having any questions or issues, just let us know. It's 19 degrees here in Alaska. It's been dumping snow in Anchorage just for Dr. von Hippel, who flew in from Arizona to try and tempt him to come back to Alaska, to this winter wonderland, and ski with us here again. Today's program is part of our Evangeline Atwood Distinguished Speaker Series, and we're thrilled to have a large group of students joining us virtually from Eagle River High School. We wanted to be in person, but wasn't able to make that happen, but we're so glad everyone is joining us today. If some of the students want to log in with your phones and ask questions during our Q&A session, that's be great. We are going to have people coming on. Just raise your hand if you want to ask a question, and we'll bring you on to ask a question. We hope some of you at Eagle River High do that as well. The World Affairs Council is part of 90 councils around the United States. We've been in longer, Alaska's been a state, and we welcome everyone here to join us during this Q&A at the end. If you're currently not a member, please do join the Alaska World Affairs Council today. Join to support unfiltered, nonpartisan, non-political programs like this, where you can directly hear from and ask questions of global thinkers and leaders like the ones we have today. We have a lot of fascinating programs coming up, both in person and virtually, so please become a member, support the organization, keep in touch with us on email and website. We are adding programs all the time. We don't have up yet. We do have cryptocurrency, China, national resilience. We're also featuring Ambassador Braithwaite, the 77th Secretary of the Navy, to talk about Arctic national security and peace. And December 3rd, we're going to feature Nathan McGowan, who will be talking about exploring indigenous political frameworks within the United States, Alaska, Canada, a comparative look at nation-to-nation relations and economic development. So please join us. And our pub trivia as we move to the spring, but we're cooking up something that's going to be a lot of fun. So please join. You can buy your Alaska airline tickets though in advance online. So get your tickets now for 2 Alaska airline tickets with no blackout dates. We really do appreciate your feedback. So if you have any comments, please send them our way. We're always trying to make programs better and relevant and exciting for all of you. This program is going to be about a 30-minute conversation followed by a Q&A. So again, if you want to ask a question in person, you can just raise your hand and we'll bring you on. And now I'd like to bring on a surprise guest to introduce our speakers. Siobhan, if you could actually help me with that, it looks like I don't have access, which is why we have a technical guru. There we go. And now introducing our speaker, one of my favorite people and past speakers here at the Alaska World Affairs Council. Coming in, you are sideways. I know things in London are a little bit to the side.
Sorry. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much, and welcome everyone to this amazing event tonight with my baby brother, Frank von Hippel, and my amazing neighbor, Professor Jim Muller. I'm Karen von Hippel. I'm a former speaker at the Alaska World Affairs Council. It's a privilege to have joined all of you in the past. And Lisa does such an incredible job that I can never say no when she asks me to do anything. So I'm joining you from 9 p.m. in London, but it's really exciting to be here to welcome my younger brother, Frank, Professor Frank von Hippel, who will be talking tonight about his new book, The Chemical Age, and about all the intended and unintended consequences of some of the innovations we make to keep ourselves safe, but often they have blowback effects. So you'll hear more about that later. My brother Frank is Alaska born and bred. He went to, all the various elementary, junior high, and East Anchorage High, as did I. And then he worked for many years at the University of Alaska Anchorage and set up a really great program trying to train people all over the state and in many parts of the world about how to understand what's happening in our environment and how to test for chemicals and pesticides and all sorts of things. So he's going to talk about his book tonight. He also has an incredible podcast called the Science History Podcast on iTunes. You can all not only buy his book, but you can also sign up for his podcast, which is free. And he will be chaired by the amazing Professor Jim Muller, who is a Churchill historian, scholar, political scientist. He has inspired thousands of Alaskan students at the University of Alaska over the years. And in fact, I only learned tonight that he was a recipient of the Alaskan Governor's Award for Distinguished Service to Humanity. So he's been an inspiration to so many people in Alaska. And it's really exciting that he is going to interview Frank. So thank you for letting me join you for a brief period tonight. And it is now my privilege to hand over the virtual floor to Professor Muller. Thank you so much.
Well, could I just say, first of all, thanks for the surprise introduction from my big sister. And thank you, Lisa, for having us. And I'll throw a little surprise your way as well, which is Karen's middle name is Lisa. So there we go.
That's wonderful. Well, Frank, welcome. Welcome back to Alaska, just in time for our biggest snowstorm of the winter so far. And it's wonderful to have you here. This is a very wide-ranging book that you've written. It's about diseases, famine, and then chemical weapons. And there's a lot of politics thrown in before you get to the question of ecology. And so I wanted to start by asking you if you could just tell us how you got so interested in this subject.
Well, thanks, Jim. And it's really a pleasure for me to have you be the interviewer since we've been friends for a long time and next door neighbors here in Alaska when I was here. So growing up here in Alaska, I was always very interested in the environment and being outdoors, and just fascinated also by history. So I'm a scientist, but I'm fascinated by history. And so I taught at the University of Alaska Anchorage for 17 years and taught a lot of courses in conservation, ecology kinds of courses, oftentimes looking at how we arrived at the point we're in now, where we're facing global challenges. And so I just love that intersection of science and history and wanted to pursue that in this book.
Well, you start out with the potato famine in Ireland, and I wonder if you could just give us a very brief understanding of how that caused people to learn a lot about pests and what you can do about them, and also some of the unintended consequences of doing that.
Sure, yeah. So the reason I selected the potato famine as the beginning of this book is that it was the largest recorded famine in history at that point. It was but it was really a result of both the political structure in Ireland and the globalization of trade. So because of the way that the Irish structure was set up with overseas English landlords controlling the lands, the Irish were really relegated to the most marginal lands in Ireland for their own subsistence crops. And the potato grew really well in these marginal lands. And it turns out you can live pretty much on the potato alone, a little bit of milk or a little bit of meat for protein, and you can survive on the potato. So the Irish population really exploded, a very rapid population growth, even though the conditions were dire with living on marginal lands because their food was nutritious with the potato. The result was that as they were restricted more and more to these marginal lands and relying on the potato, about 90% of the population of Ireland was living on this monoculture of a single crop. And So the moment that a pathogen arrived in Ireland that infected the crop, it was a disaster. And that pathogen happened to be a water mold species similar to a fungus that infected the crop. The pathogen came from the Americas. It came over with the merchant fleet, probably also as a result of innovations in technology, because the steamship allowed more rapid passage across the Atlantic Ocean, and that probably allowed the pathogen to survive that journey and then infect the crops.
And is that what is called a vector by scientists? Or?
The vector would be what carries it. So we're normally, when we're talking about a mosquito that carries the malaria parasite, that the mosquito is the vector, the pathogen is the parasite that causes it. So, so that's not a vector-borne disease, but it was a plant disease that then affected the crops. And then the Irish their crop failed. In 1845, the crop failed pretty much completely. And suddenly the population was at a loss for food. And what this resulted in is over 1 million Irish perished in the famine, and over 1 million Irish emigrated from Ireland to the Americas, to Australia, to England, and so on. So it completely changed the ethnic makeup of our country, but it also changed many other things. Unfortunately, at that time, people still believed in spontaneous generation, that pathogens just arose spontaneously, and therefore there's nothing you can do about it if they just.
So this was really a challenge for scientists to try to get to the bottom of what was causing it. And what kind of research were those scientists doing at that time? I mean, what did their research look like?
Yeah, so the research seems comical today, because they thought that the famine was caused by changes in lightning storms, or changes in the way that or as God's agency, or all kinds of things that had nothing to do with it. And because if the paradigm at the time was that diseases arose spontaneously, therefore you have to look for these kind of extra scientific causes of it. And the one who got the closest was a scientist named Berkeley, who had been the scientist who documented all of the fungus species on the Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle. And he actually discovered the pathogen, but he couldn't prove that it was the cause of the blight and not a consequence of the blight. So it wouldn't be until 20 years later when the cause of the blight was discovered, which is a water mold called Phytophthora infestans, which means infecting plant destroyer. And once the pathogen was discovered, now you have a target where you could figure out how do you kill that pathogen and therefore prevent future pandemics. So really it was critical to discover the cause. With any of these pandemics, just like we're living through today, it was critical to discover the cause. We're very lucky today that it only took about a week for scientists to figure out the cause of once the COVID pandemic started. It only took about a week to figure out the virus that caused it and even sequence the genome of that virus. But of course, back then that was completely impossible. So a solution to potato blight famine wouldn't come for another 20 years after the Irish potato famine. But for me, that was a good launching point to understand why scientists were racing to discover chemicals to prevent famine and also to prevent disease. When people are starving to death, they generally are actually die of disease, because when you're starving, your immune system shuts down. And most of the Irish who died during the pandemic, during the Irish potato famine, died of typhus and relapsing fever. They died of lice-borne illnesses, because when conditions are dirty, filthy, crowded, that's great for lice, and the lice carry typhus and carry these other diseases.
Now, Ireland at that point, of course, wasn't independent. It was part of the British Empire. And it's partly because the British Empire extended to other places as well that the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine was invented. And in part, it was invented because it would have to be a place where people began to try to figure out how to make these places safe for other people to live. And specifically, I suppose, for those who were going to administer them or rule them, although ultimately they were certainly interested in the native inhabitants of those places too. But when your book, which is very wide ranging, switches over from famine to talking about specific diseases. You have chapters on malaria and all sorts of other illnesses, typhus and other things. And I wonder if you could talk about how the scientific research changed, perhaps became slightly more professionalized, but also still a kind of contest of different ambitious scientists in trying to get to the bottom of what caused those various diseases, which eventually were conquered or at least beaten back considerably by new discoveries.
Yeah, it's a great question. So Louis Pasteur disproved spontaneous generation in 1859, which is the same year that Darwin published On the Origin of Species. And that became the beginning of what I view as the most remarkable period of scientific discovery ever, the period of the discovery of the germ theory of disease, which was really led by Louis Pasteur in France and Robert Koch in Germany. The two of them were competing against each other, but they were really discovering one disease after another. What is the cause of that disease and what is the vector of that disease? So one of the interesting ones and one of the latest ones to be solved was malaria. And with malaria, the first ones to be discovered were bacterial diseases and things like cholera. And with malaria, the difficulty was that it's not a bacterium that causes it. It's a small parasite, a plasmodium, and it's so really didn't fit their original paradigm of how do we discover one of these diseases. So the cause of malaria wasn't discovered until 1892, when a British physician, Sir Ronald Ross, who was working in India at the time for the military as part of a military doctor, decided to try to study this. And he was the one, after just painstaking, grueling research over a primitive microscope, looking at thousands of mosquitoes, and he figured out what the parasite was, and that it was carried by a particular kind of mosquito of the genus Anopheles. Anopheles in Greek means good for nothing. And it was actually named before it was known that it vectors disease, which is kind of interesting. But Ronald Ross, he discovered it despite the British government, because they threw every obstacle in his way imaginable. Every time he was close to discovery, they'd reassign him to something else. They'd move him somewhere else. And he ended up using avian malaria, which is basically the birds serve as a reservoir for malaria, to figure out experimentally that it's vectored by mosquitoes. And one of the interesting things about that, in terms of the social history and colonial history of the time, is that malaria and a few other diseases, yellow fever being another one, were really impediments to colonization. Because if we take Africa as an example, in sub-Saharan Africa, there's widespread immunity to malaria because a lot of people are heterozygous for sickle cell anemia. So they have one normal gene for sickle cell anemia and one mutated gene, but if you're heterozygous for it, you're resistant to the malarial parasite, but you are still carrying a normal oxygen load. The colonists from Europe didn't have this immunity, natural immunity. And Koch discovered that children are the reservoir for malaria in Africa. And so what was their response to it was, let's segregate the Europeans from the Africans. So segregation in the colonies actually began as a way to protect the European colonists from diseases for which the Africans served as the reservoir. So they were thinking about, let's protect the Europeans, not so much let's protect the people we're colonizing. But it then led to a lot of racist policies. So if we see the development of segregation in places like South Africa, that traces back to public health measures of the colonial powers.
I think, by hearing you talk about this from the point of view of history and even imperial policy, the people who are listening to our conversation begin to get an idea of how wide-ranging this book is that you wrote. And I wanted to ask you a question about that. We live in a time when university departments where professors are employed are little limited places where people read each other's work and don't often venture outside their academic field. And one of the things that appealed to me about reading this book was it took me into a whole bunch of questions I hadn't known very much about. And yet I found as a reader of it that, first of all, you wrote very well. Second, I could understand what you were arguing, at least up to a satisfying point. But I wonder what kind of blowback you've had from people in disciplinary fields, either your own biology or the field you've sort of jumped into and written about, chemistry, to the idea of a biologist writing about chemistry, or the idea of a biology professor writing the history of science, or even the history of other things.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because we're so siloed in today's world, especially in academics, and in a way we're discouraged from working outside of our field because we're told you can't be as productive if you stray from your narrow specialty.
And yet everybody knows that the most exceptional people and the ones whose books are worth reading and widely read have done exactly that. I mean, I noticed you mentioned in almost the same breath Louis Pasteur, whose lab I walked by when I was living in Paris the year after college. And later, of course, in your book, Marie Curie, whose lab was in the same part of Paris, the 5th arrondissement, and also Darwin, who really would be thought of as writing in a very different field. And I wonder how you successfully went about drawing evidence for your book, and topics too, from all those different fields that are normally, left to much more specific kind of scholarship.
Well, I think this really brings up the value of a liberal arts education. And so we still have this tradition in the United States of a liberal arts education, which is rare in the world. Most countries don't. You finish high school, you go to specialize right after high school. And so I feel like I've benefited from that. When I was in college, every semester I took my load of scientific classes, and then I always took one liberal arts class every term, and just whatever seemed interesting. And I think and also the value of reading. So we read a lot in our family growing up, and that was a great habit to develop. And I love to read. And so I think reading widely and then finding the right connections is a big part of it. But also in terms of the blowback, this book has been reviewed by many different places. And what I've noticed is that the reviews that are in chemical, historical societies, those kinds of places, tend to be kind of negative and nitpicky about some details. The reviews that are in more general audience places like the New York Review of Books or places like that have been very positive. And so part of it is in the disciplinary realm, I think people can get bogged down in the details, and then they're upset you didn't talk about this detail or that detail, rather than seeing that really the goal here is to see the big picture of how society
that would have been the case, say, with Rachel Carson too, whose book you mentioned toward the end of your book as being very important for bringing some of the questions of pesticides and environmental protection to the attention of her fellow citizens. And I guess she was criticized by some for taking on a big, broad subject and trying to bring it to the attention of a wide public.
Yeah, she was massively criticized. I think the criticism of Rachel Carson upon the publication of Silent Spring in 1962 was the largest criticism of an author ever in terms of bringing something to the public. She first published it in a serialized form in the New Yorker in June 1962, and the book didn't come out until September 1962. But between June and September, the chemical industry organized a massive effort, several $100,000 of effort, which was a lot of money for back then, to combat against the book. And they threatened to sue the publisher if they proceeded, and they attacked her on television and the news. But actually that was a good thing, because all of that attention that they brought against her made people want to read the book. And her book stood up to, it was rigorous, it stood up to that. And although she didn't begin the environmental movement, she popularized the environmental movement. So it actually played a very important historical role. Her book maybe played a bigger role in the history, certainly of anything I can think of in the 20th century, of a single book catching fire and motivating a movement than any other I can think of.
Now, in a way, every book is a mirror of its author. And I think in the case of your book, you've made an interesting choice. Most people, especially those I think who write scholarly books, try to use camouflage and try to hide themselves a bit, try to follow certain conventions of writing in a way that distances themselves personally a bit from what they're writing. And yet in your book, especially at the end, there's a tremendous connection with people in your own family history. And particularly when it comes to the question of chemical weapons and the development of other weapons and the danger to scientists and frankly everyone else from the Nazi regime, there's a lot about that in your book. And I wondered, first of all, if you could tell us why you and your publisher at University of Chicago Press were brave enough to put this right out in front, though you came to it gradually, but I'd have to say toward the end of the book, a bit suddenly and surprisingly, and it ended up being of great interest to the reader. So maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I wrote the whole book without anything about my family. So it's all third person, just formal kind of typical historical analysis. But going back to the first question you asked me, I really should have answered it differently, which is that the reason that I was motivated to write this book was actually I grew up hearing the stories that I wrote about because my family was deeply involved in it. And so after I wrote the book, I decided, well, I'm going to do an experiment. I'm going to write an epilogue that's about my family's connection to this history and just see if the editor at Chicago likes it. And if not, fine. But if they do, it'll be kind of a creative way to end the book. And so it was very quick for me to write that part because it's the family history that I know really well. I wrote it in a few days. And I spent 9 years writing the book. So writing the epilogue in a few days felt rapid fire to me. But I sent it to the editor and the editor loved it. So we ended up including it in the book. But essentially what it is, and for those who read the book, I think it's better to read it last, to read the epilogue last. But essentially, my great-grandfather, James Franck, he was a physicist who did the experiment that showed that Niels Bohr's idea for the structure of the atom was correct. So Niels Bohr won the Nobel Prize in physics in 1922, and my great-grandfather, James Franck, won the Nobel Prize in physics in 1925 for demonstrating experimentally that was the case. But before that, during World War I, James Franck had actually been fighting for the German military. He had been injured on both the Western and the Eastern fronts. And he was then assigned to work at Fritz Haber's institute in the chemical weapons program. So Fritz Haber developed chlorine gas, and it was the first successful use of a weapon of mass destruction. It wasn't the first use of a weapon of mass destruction. It had been tried before. The Russians tried and failed. It was the first successful use where they were able to kill a lot of people. And my great-grandfather was Haber's assistant, and he and several other future Nobel laureates were on the gas mask testing crew. So they would go into a sealed room, expose themselves to these chemical weapons, horrible weapons like mustard gas and chlorine gas, with gas masks on and see how effective the gas masks were, which seems incredible that they would do this, but they were self-experimenting. And so he was involved with that during World War I. And then he ended up running the Physics Institute II, which was an important physics institute in Germany after World War I. And when the Nazis rose to power, one of the first things that they did is they fired Jewish professors. And my great-grandfather was exempt from being fired because he won an Iron Cross in World War I, and the war heroes were initially exempt. But he resigned his directorship of the Physics Institute in protest against the anti-Semitic policies. And he then left Germany, and he went to work with Niels Bohr. And then there's a whole story around how my grandfather, who was a physicist in Göttingen, was able to get out. My father was already born then, so he was born in Germany along with my uncle, and they ended up basically getting saved by getting recruited to Turkey, where Ataturk, at the recommendation of Einstein and my great-grandfather and some others, was setting up a modern university. So they were able to get out of Nazi Germany to Turkey, and then from there to Niels Bohr's Institute, and then recruited to the United States. And once in the United States, once the Manhattan Project began, my great-grandfather was put in charge of the chemistry division of the Manhattan Project. So he was involved with development of weapons of mass destruction of World War I, at least in terms of the testing of gas masks against them. And then he was involved with the development of the nuclear bomb. And then he wrote something called the Frank Report, which was top secret, to the president, arguing that we shouldn't use the bomb against Japan. So there's this whole history there. And my grandfather, Arthur von Hippel, ended up at MIT and ended up building a large material science lab for the US military, where they developed things like crystals for the US Army, for the radios. He developed uniforms with vinyl chloride that wouldn't break down in the jungles of New Guinea. He developed the dielectric materials for radar for the US military. So I just find that very interesting, that they both fought for Germany in World War I in the trenches, and then they both ended up, fighting for the Americans in terms of the science of the war effort, because it was a total war, right? All aspects of society were involved. So they fought for the Americans against Germany in World War II.
Frank, I know we're getting toward the end of our time before it's time for questions. So I guess I just have one last question to ask you in this part, and that is, your book's selling well. If there were a chance in a few years, perhaps, for you to put out a revised second edition, and you decided to add a chapter on this pandemic we're going through, what would you be thinking about and focusing on?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I wrote this book, I started this book in 2011, so it was well before the pandemic.
Right.
And then I ended up covering 4 pandemics in the book, and I chose 4 in particular because they each demonstrate a different part of the history. So I initially looked at about 20 pandemics, and then of those I selected 4 that illustrated what I wanted to illustrate. And I wouldn't include COVID in this book because it doesn't actually illustrate the chemical history in the way that I want. I mean, we're incredibly lucky that this pandemic hit now rather than 15 years ago, because just in the last 15 years, the technologies have developed to such an extent that scientists were able to sequence the genome in about a week. They're able to develop multiple effective vaccines in about 10 months, including the testing and getting them ready for deployment. And that's unheard of in history. And not only that, but the vaccines that we have now are as effective as the most effective vaccines ever developed, which were for polio. So people don't realize how lucky we are that this has all happened so fast. And there's new treatments now for when you're sick that really reduce the incidence of mortality. But if we go back and look at historically, like take typhus as an example, when typhus epidemics would hit, and they always hit during war, typhus is an epidemic of war because it's vectored by the body louse, and the body louse ends up becoming rampant during war.
In the trenches.
In the trenches and in the shelters and all of that. And people's immune system is weakened during war because they're undernourished and so on. Typhus, when typhus epidemics hit, typically the mortality rate starts around 30% and it peaks around 70%. So we're talking about a pandemic now where the mortality rate is under 1%. And this is what our ancestors had to face. Or when bubonic plague hit, I have a chapter on bubonic plague. When bubonic plague hit, it was a mortality rate of around 50% of Europe and the Middle East died. And so that just makes society completely collapse. What we're dealing with now is tiny compared to that.
Well, thank you. And I know we have both people who are members of the Alaska World Affairs Council and probably also some students who have questions they'd like to ask. So Lisa, I'll turn it back over to you to help us with those questions.
Thank you so much. There is a lot of interest, Frank. There's so much I want to hear, and I'm going to let people come in one at a time. We first have Dr. Paul Dunscombe, who'd like to ask a question in person. Paul, over to you.
Hi, good afternoon. Once again, welcome from snowy Anchorage. Glad you got to experience our couple of feet of snow in person. Listening to your talk, which was quite fascinating, and I actually very much look forward to reading the book. I was very powerfully reminded of Richard Rhodes' Making of the Atomic Bomb and his discussion of the operation of what he called the Republic of Science, and how by that operation, this sharing of knowledge, this corporate, if you will, or group effort to kind of understand the nature of the atom, when the discovery of nuclear fission actually happens, the implications of that are immediately understood worldwide. And it seems that your story parallels that in some interesting ways, but also diverges from that in some interesting ways. I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
Well, Paul, thanks for the question. Yeah, the nuclear history, there's so many parallels between the nuclear history and the chemical history. And nuclear history gets far more attention just because the power of the nuclear bomb is it's just something else. But then again, the parallels then on the history are striking. If you go back and you look at Time magazine right after the use of the first nuclear device in Japan in August 1945, there's a front page story on the atomic bomb, and right next to it, there's a front page story on DDT. So the two of them were presented right together. And of course, DDT also helped America to win the war, because we used it to combat yellow fever and typhus throughout the Pacific War Theater and the North African and Southern European war theaters. And up until that modern use of chemicals to fight pandemics, more people died in war from disease than from combat, in virtually every single combat. And even during World War II, it started out that way. General MacArthur complained that he had 9 soldiers in the hospital with malaria for every soldier he had on the battlefield in the Pacific Theater in the first couple of years of the war. And how could we possibly win the war with so many people sick? So there are incredible parallels between chemicals, chemical weapons, and nuclear weapons, and the whole history there, all the way up to the point where, if you look at when the treaties started to happen to ban these things or ban first use of them, that really began with 1968 to 1970 was the banning of testing of chemical weapons that came into force. And 1969 was the beginning of the same thing on chemical weapons, with the US finally signing on to the banning of the first use of chemical weapons, up to 1974, when President Ford signed off on the banning of herbicidal weapons. And we had used pesticides as a weapon of war in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. So they really do parallel right up through modern times. And there's just a lot more attention on the nuclear side.
So thank you very much for that. Appreciate that.
I'm going to read a question from the students. Another one says, Frank, your grandpa's a legend. So a lot of great comments. This question from the students is, as someone who has studied pandemics and comes from a line of those who have worked on chemical weapons, what do you believe the future holds for biowarfare?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I just interviewed for my podcast a scientist named Zia Mian, who has been looking at nuclear weapons, nuclear disarmament for his whole career, and a very thoughtful person. We were talking about kind of this very question. And the problem is that once society and scientists decide to develop something, it's very hard not to use it. So if you think about nuclear weapons as an example, we put an incredible investment into the Manhattan Project. And it cost an amazing amount of money and an amazing amount of intellectual resources for us to build the bomb. And everything has an opportunity cost. So if we put in all of those resources to build the atomic bomb, it means we were not using those resources for something else, but it also meant there was then pressure to use it. And modern scholarship shows us that we really didn't use the bomb to end World War II. World War II was going to end anyway. Japan was already heading towards surrender. And we were already bombing cities to the ground in Japan with our bombs and our chemical incendiary devices. So it was really a demonstration to the Soviet Union that we had this power and nobody else had this power, and we were going to use it. The scientists recommended having two things. They recommended having a demonstration of the power of the bomb rather than using it on a civilian target. And if that was not feasible to end the war, they recommended that the decision had to be made by the United Nations, or something that didn't exist yet, but by the nations of the world, not by a few politicians in power. So unfortunately, we need to not even develop the technology to begin with, or the pressures, the political pressures to use it become so great that they end up being used. We've seen it with chemical weapons too. So during World War II, many new technologies were developed, one of which was herbicides. They were developed, they were basically scientists at the University of Chicago figured out that we could manipulate plant hormones to kill plants, and that's the basis of herbicides. Those herbicides were then pretty much immediately weaponized. And in fact, the scientists who developed them wanted the US military to use them against Japan to destroy crops in Japan in order to starve the enemy in Japan. But we and others used them in warfare immediately after World War II. So it's a great question.
And now a question from Patty.
Well, first, Frank, I want to say hello from all your friends at Alaska Community Action on Toxics. It's been a pleasure and an honor working with you and your team to look at the chemical contamination at St. Lawrence Island and other places. And it's been an amazing journey, and we're looking forward to staying on that path with you till we get to the end of wherever it leads us. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
And my question actually relates to that, is that similar to what Dr. Dunscombe said about the parallels with nuclear and the chemical branch that you described, you know, I see a similar undeclared war on all humanity from synthetic petrochemicals and the way they are dispersed throughout the environment, unacknowledged and very difficult to find and get the, you know, the information. There's no research, or there's not enough research, and then making the connection between that and the illnesses that people are suffering. It's not as easy as finding the bug, the virus, the bacteria, whatever. And so I'm wondering if all of your research that has to do with chemical contamination, if you see the parallels, and if your book might reveal some, in the parallels, might reveal some way forward, because it is the amount of chemical contamination and health harms associated with that is reaching a crisis. I think both especially for Indigenous people in the North, in Alaska and the rest of the Arctic, but also for the rest of the globe as well. And we need to do something different than what we're doing. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah, thanks, Patty. And it's been great to work with ACAT for many years. And actually, it's an example of how to solve problems. I think it works best to have the scientists that need to be involved working with community groups, because the community groups that are engaged with the community are best placed to help to bring the science to the level it needs to be at, which is why we work together. But going back to your question, I think that we need to have our chemical policy be exactly the opposite of the way it is today, not only in the United States, but around the world. So the way that it works today is that if a chemical company develops a new chemical, they can bring it to market and they can disperse it around the world in vast quantities. And there's no restrictions on them doing that. And then they have a lot of resources. And then the under-resourced researchers, community groups, and so on are the ones who then have to demonstrate that this chemical is toxic. And then it's usually about a 20-year period of fighting to get it off the market. And then once it's off the market, there's a so-called regrettable replacement where the chemical companies make more money by developing a new chemical to replace the one that just got pulled off the market. And we see this over and over again. So, originally in the first half of the 20th century, pesticides for fighting insects, insecticides were primarily lead-based or other heavy metal-based compounds that were very dangerous because residues were left on the food. So if you ate an apple that wasn't washed, you could die from it, from lead poisoning. And so then we switched to the organochlorine pesticides that were first developed by Paul Mueller in 1939 and became widespread after World War II. But those damaged the environment, led to birds going extinct, all kinds of ecological harm. So then we switched to the organophosphate insecticides, which were first developed by the Nazi scientist Gerhard Schrader as nerve agents during World War II for the Nazis. And those broke down in the environment much faster, but they were very dangerous for the farm workers. And we saw tremendous numbers of deaths and illness among farm workers. And then we switched to the neonicotinoid insecticides, which are safer for the farm workers, but they are leading to widespread bird losses again. And so, again and again and again, this is the history of chemicals. And right now, there's probably something like 150,000 synthetic chemicals that are widespread in the environment. We have no idea how they interact with each other in that complexity to cause various illnesses, and yet we continue to throw them out there. So when it's a drug, the drug companies have to go through all these clinical trials to prove safety before they can bring it to market, like we've seen rushed this year with the COVID vaccinations. But when it's a new pesticide, when it's a new chemical for making plastic dishware, whatever, they don't have to do that. And that is completely backwards. Our chemical industry should have to go through the same rigorous testing for safety as the pharmaceutical industry has to do.
Frank, what makes you optimistic about the future on this question, about which you've obviously given us some reasons for pessimism?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a really important point because I think it's critical that we maintain a positive attitude on how do we contend with these issues. We're facing major global threats from climate change to pollution to deforestation to you name it. There's a lot of very big issues that we're all dealing with right now.
And of course, people are increasingly looking at the oceans too.
Which relates to climate change as well, because the increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere also acidifies the oceans, which leads to coral reef loss and biodiversity loss. And oceans are rising because of melting ice. And actually most of the ocean rise is due to thermal expansion of water, not to melting ice. So these are major issues. And I think one thing that gives me optimism is my kids' generation seems to be really engaged with these problems and wanting to solve these problems. And we've seen with a number of issues that society can change pretty fast in the way that we approach them. Also, there have been major technological advances that should allow us to shift the way we do things, like shifting from fossil fuels to solar energy would be a good example of that, where the cost of solar energy and the just the ability of photovoltaic cells to do this kind of energy production have increased incredibly fast. So I think it's a combination of creative people coming up with new ideas and new technologies to contend with these things, but also a new generation of people who are engaged and want to change the political process, because we won't actually be able to solve the problems we're facing, climate change, pollution, any of these problems, without changing the way that we do our politics. And unfortunately, we're in a very difficult political time. It's hyper polarized. The last time I think the United States has faced a situation like this was 1968. And so we have to be able to work together across our political differences if we're going to solve these problems and not just be fighting each other all the time. So that's a separate problem that as a scientist, I don't know what the solution is, but we have to solve the way that we fight instead of work together. And in fact, these environmental problems, they shouldn't be political problems. They shouldn't be politicized because they affect everybody. It doesn't matter what you think about something like prayer in schools. We can't have our society wrecked by a wrecked climate or wrecked by pollution. We should all be working together no matter what our political bent. So that's a part of it, is just having dialogue and not doing things that turn people off to each other, but doing things that promote engagement with each other.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Lisa.
I'm back. And now I'm going to bring on Kathy Campbell. Hopefully she has some students here who can come up on the video. Kathy, over to you.
There you are. Okay. We're all here. Thank you. Here's the Go class. Anyway, everybody say hi. Okay. Hi, my name is Jazzy Trotter and I'm an Eagle River student. And so my question is that you mentioned in regards to the potato famine that scientists tried to find a cause and a way to combat the blight, but they just didn't have the knowledge or the technology. You stated we're lucky that the current pandemic happened now, not 15 years ago. But we still haven't really perfected a vaccine or a foolproof method to stop the spread of COVID. Since hindsight is 2020, what do you think that scientists will look back and say that we could have done better, or technology that we should have used instead of the one that we're using now?
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, I would say that we've been super successful on the vaccines, because the vaccines tend to have about 95% efficacy, which is as good as any vaccine ever developed in history. And so we can't expect that we would have done something better, but it is a new technology. So messenger RNA vaccine is new. It's previously been used with animals like chickens. So it had been used in animals, but not in people. But it's, and I think really the problem is not with the technology development. The problem is with political messaging, that too many people either don't understand the science or are scared of the science, and so don't want to take this vaccine, even though it's a lifesaver. And also we have a problem in society where humans are very bad at understanding risk. And so, we might be terrified of getting attacked by a grizzly bear in the forest, but then we'll jump on a snow machine at 60 miles an hour and race across a lake. And the risk of getting hurt or dying from that snow machine ride is probably 10,000 times greater than the risk of getting attacked by a grizzly bear. So we're just terrible at risk. We'll get in the car and drive around in a dangerous place in the car, but then we're scared of flying. And the risk of flying is so much on a commercial airline is much lower than the risk of driving. And in that sense, I think people are scared of this new technology, and rightfully so, but it is very safe. So where we have failed is in our political realm. And if you look at the infection rates of COVID in the United States, they're among the worst in the world. We've done worse than Venezuela, which is a collapsed narco state. And so if it's that bad here, that tells us we have a serious political problem in this country. There are many countries in the world that you would think would be less resilient than we are, that have done much better than us. In fact, most of the world has done much better than us, despite us being one of the wealthiest countries in the world.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm going to bring on Dick Lefevre to ask our next question. Dick, over to you.
It's been great to have you. I'm sorry, get my camera on here. To have you present today. And I grew up on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation in eastern Montana. And I'm just wondering, I know you talked about the impact on people across the world, but what about in the indigenous population? Of course, here in Alaska, obviously, you know, the widespread use of, well, even going back to the detonation of the nuclear bomb and widespread use of pesticides, chemicals. Say something about federal policy and what has contributed to widespread use of those pesticides, and also what can we do to reverse some of those, the harm that's been done?
Yeah, thank you for your question, Dick. It's a great question. And actually, in my research, I mostly work with tribal communities on pollution problems. I do work with other communities as well, like in Arizona on the border, I work with migrant and seasonal farm workers coming from Mexico and their exposures to pesticides. But I mostly work with tribes, including in Alaska and Arizona and Central and South America and Australia. And oftentimes they have higher exposures than the population at large for a variety of reasons. In Alaska, there's lower exposures in some way because we have some of the cleanest water on the planet and some of the cleanest air on the planet. But we are at high latitude, and there's a certain class of chemicals called persistent organic pollutants that evaporate from their area of use at lower latitude, and they accumulate in the Arctic, and they're fat soluble, so they end up accumulating in animals, especially high trophic level animals. So many Arctic indigenous people that live off of the marine environment, eating ice seals and bowhead whale and walrus and things like that, end up exposed to high levels of these chemicals. There are things like PCBs and chlorinated pesticides like DDT. So that's really a case of an environmental injustice because they had no say over their use. They didn't economically benefit from their use, yet they're exposed to high concentrations. I also work with ACAT on contaminants coming from Cold War military installations in tribal communities in Alaska, where the military oftentimes left behind a pretty big mess of thousands of barrels of who knows what in these communities. And so we try to figure out what are the chemicals that are coming from these barrels and how might they impact human health and what can we do about it. But we also see this with other communities. So going to Arizona, for example, the Navajo Nation has major problems with uranium contamination because that's where we mined uranium for our nuclear weapons and nuclear energy program. And we mined it as a country in an irresponsible way that left behind this incredible legacy of pollution. So they have tremendous health problems there from uranium as a legacy of the nuclear program. And we could go through examples throughout the country. But because tribal nations also have sovereignty and nation relations with the United States, they also have some tools available to them to address these issues that are not available to some other communities. And it's important for tribes to recognize that and take advantage of those tools.
It looks like we're running out of time. I'll have one more that's been brought here through the chat function, and it says, so far there's been talk on how chemical developments is reflecting biological developments. Is it safe to assume that nuclear developments will reflect those, or do you believe that nuclear will be different, and why?
Yeah, that's a complicated question, but there is some overlap. And in fact, if you read Silent Spring, Rachel Carson used nuclear fallout as a metaphor to understand chemical pollution because of the parallels between them. So she actually discussed radiation and nuclear fallout before she ever discussed pesticides. And also one of the things that primed the public attention, that made the public receptive to Silent Spring and made the book so popular, is that in the late 1950s, scientists discovered that babies' teeth had strontium-90 in it, which was a result of atmospheric testing of nuclear bombs by the United States and the Soviet Union. And wow, if our baby's teeth has radioactive elements in it because of this nuclear testing, that tells us we're doing something really wrong. We still live in a world where we could have a nuclear war in under half an hour because we have a handful of people who make the decisions about whether to launch nuclear wars, and with intercontinental ballistic missiles, they can reach their target in half an hour. So we still live in a very dangerous world. It's not maybe as dangerous in terms of risk of nuclear war as it was when I was a kid, when we were in very high tension about it. I remember we had nuclear drills in Anchorage back then about how do you get to a fallout shelter. So it's a little bit less dangerous in that way, but it's still a risky world, and we still need to contend with this. We definitely need to contend with denuclearizing the world and getting rid of nuclear weapons, but we need to do that also with biological weapons and chemical weapons. We shouldn't have any of these weapons of mass destruction. So all of them are tied together and they have a lot of parallels. And there's something that we need to address all at once.
That's a really great summary. Thank you so very much, Dr. Frank von Hippel and Dr. Jim Muller, for joining us here today at the Alaska World Affairs Council. And thank you everyone who could tune in for joining and supporting our commitment to bringing quality educational programs to you and our passion to increase all of our global competency. If you have any comments or suggestions, please send them our way. And please do look at the books we were referring to. We'll have links on our website and we'll have them in our post-program slide deck. You can see The Chemical Age and the Science History Podcast by Dr. von Hippel and The River War by Dr. Muller. Also, we'll be back here December 3rd. Hope to see you with Nathan McGowan, who will be exploring indigenous political frameworks within the United States, Alaska, and Canada. And we appreciate your support during these challenging financial times. So please do donate to the World Affairs Council, and we look forward to seeing all of you virtually or in person again. And have a great rest of your day, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.